Officially founded in 1934 by legendary aircraft designer Alexander Sergeyevich Yakovlev, the roots of the famed bureau that ultimately bore Yakovlev's name for nearly 3/4 of a century date back almost a decade further. In the mid-1920s, the bright, young, and little-known student of the Zhukovsky Military Aviation Academy proudly unveiled a less-than-revolutionary biplane for the Soviet Department of Light Aircraft. Understandably, his instructors weren't particularly thrilled with the design, but Yakovlev forged ahead by assembling a team of eager students who built the aircraft in their spare time. Featuring an open cockpit and a wooden frame covered in thick fabric, the Air I was powered by a piddly 60-horsepower inline 4-cylinder engine that gave it a top speed of just 87 miles per hour, or 140 kilometers an hour. The Air I wasn't a thoroughbred even by 1920 standards, but its light airframe and anemic power plant gave it a range of approximately 750 miles or 1,200 kilometers. With a service ceiling of about 4,000 feet, had more Air I's been built, they may have been well suited to long-distance reconnaissance roles, but only if they'd been restricted to flying at night when the likelihood of being downed by ground fire and enemy aircraft was far less. Fast forward more than a decade from these rather humble beginnings, Yakovlev's design bureau would go on to create some of the Soviet Union's most iconic aircraft, many of which have been largely forgotten today. So, we're going to amend that today and take a look at some of them. In the months leading up to Operation Barbarossa in late June of 1941, Germany amassed the largest invasion force the world had ever seen, including nearly 3 million men, 6,000 tanks, 3,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft. The Nazi juggernaut would clash with an even larger Soviet defense force, though the latter was less organized, less experienced, and largely supplied with hopelessly outdated equipment. Taking control of the skies over the vast theater was vital for both sides, but finding a way to stem the tide of advancing armor was an even bigger priority for the Soviets. What the country needed in its darkest hour were light and medium bombers and dedicated ground attack aircraft capable of reducing columns of tanks and other armored vehicles to smoldering heaps of scrap metal. Originally known as the YA-22, the heavily armored twin-engine speedster that would eventually become the Yak II first flew in January 1939. But though war was still more than a year away, an ominously dark cloud hovered over Europe and the Soviet Union. Featuring long tails, stubby noses, and 960 horsepower Klimov V-12s protruding from the front of each wing, Yak IIs resembled more well-known aircraft of the day, like the de Havilland Mosquitoes and Messerschmitt Bf-110s. Nearly 31 feet long, 46 feet from wingtip to wingtip, and tipping the scales of nearly 12,000 pounds, and crewed by 3 airmen, when fully loaded for combat, early Yak IIs were capable of speeds in excess of 350 miles per hour or 560 kilometers an hour, making them the fastest multi-engined aircraft that the Soviets had. With the situation worsening, even before testing was complete, Stalin ordered the aircraft into limited production in the spring of 1939. Incorporating both wood and metal structural components, the planes were covered with fabric to reduce weight, and the crew compartments were notoriously cramped. Nonetheless, even as production lines whirred to life, Yak designers and Air Force representatives continued to evaluate and address the aircraft's shortcomings. Due to inefficient radiators, the engines generated excessive heat, and the brakes, landing gears, and fuel systems were all unreliable as well. In addition, horizontal and vertical stability were constant sources of concern, which meant that Yak IIs could be death traps in the hands of inexperienced pilots. Most of these issues were resolved on later production models, though, as is often the case, weight steadily increased, resulting in significant drops in both climb rate, top speed, and agility. Most Yak IIs were equipped with two 30-caliber defensive machine guns, could carry approximately 1,300 pounds of bombs, and had combat ranges approaching 500 miles. Several specialized Yak II variants were also produced, including the stripped-down and even faster R-12 reconnaissance aircraft and the Cab tank buster, the latter of which were fitted with 20mm cannon packs slung under their fuselages. But despite the aircraft's flexibility and all-around promise, by the time of the German invasion, less than 100 had been produced. Even worse, those that had been delivered to frontline units, many were destroyed on the ground by the Luftwaffe in the operation's opening days. In fact, by mid-July, it was estimated that less than half a dozen Yak IIs had survived. Needless to say, they played no significant role in the epic engagement. As one of Yakovlev's most iconic aircraft, the Yak IX was the end result of a long design process that began well before the Second World War. Successor to the Yaks I, III, and VII, the single-seat, low-wing, high-performance fighter was a rare bright spot for the Soviet Union when the skies over the beleaguered country were teeming with Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s flown by experienced pilots. Due to the increasingly dire situation, Yak IXs were pressed into service in October of 1942, just a few months after first taking to the air. Upon delivery to frontline regiments, Yak IXs in the hands of proficient pilots immediately began leveling the playing field against the seemingly invincible Luftwaffe, and perhaps more importantly, they were lethally effective tank busters, especially during the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943. Bearing a strong resemblance to Supermarine Spitfires, Yak IXs featured narrow fuselages, characteristically short tails, and low-slung bubble canopies that gave pilots excellent all-round visibility. In addition, their light airframes and powerful 1,500 horsepower liquid-cooled Klimov V12 engines not only provided excellent performance, but also allowed Yak IXs to carry more fuel and armament than most other aircraft of similar size. Likewise, Yak IXs were relatively easy to control even by inexperienced pilots, and they were capable of outmaneuvering most German fighters at low and medium altitudes. With maximum speeds approaching 420 miles per hour and service ceilings of more than 35,000 feet, they could climb faster than most of the aircraft they were pitted against in combat. As such, German pilots were often instructed not to engage Yak IXs except when at high altitudes or when the element of surprise was on their side. Variants including the 37mm Yak 9T and Yak 9Ks that sported even more potent 45mm cannons that fired directly through the propeller hub, and both of these were adept at knocking out armor and larger aircraft from great ranges. Others, like the Yak 9B fighter bombers, had internal bomb bays behind their cockpits that were capable of carrying nearly 900 pounds of munitions, while D models were equipped with high-volume drop tanks under their wings, which extended range so significantly that they could escort bombers to and from Eastern Europe. All told, various Yak IX variants incorporated 2 different wing designs, 5 different engines, 6 different fuel tank configurations, and more than half a dozen armament setups. On the downside, early models were plagued with various teething issues, including inefficient radiators, persistent oil leaks, loss of engine pressure during hard climbs, and intense vibrations at high speeds that were known to cause stress fractures in the airframes. Most of these issues were ironed out as time progressed, however, and though weight crept up with each successive variant, with gross weights of approximately 7,100 pounds, Yak IXs were among the smallest and lightest combat aircraft of the war. By comparison, many P-51 Mustang variants were nearly twice as heavy, and early models had about the same horsepower, though this increased significantly by the war's end. Official statistics are hard to come by, but it's likely that Yak IXs collectively destroyed thousands of tanks and aircraft during the Great Patriotic War. The Yak IX was the first Soviet aircraft to shoot down a Messerschmitt Me-262 jet, and First Lieutenant A.I. Bornov, flying a Yak 9T, single-handedly scored 19 aerial kills, for which he was awarded the Gold Star Medal of the Hero of the Soviet Union in June of 1945. But though they were already showing their age in 1945, in the following years, Yak IXs would once again be pressed into service as the Cold War heated up, this time harassing French, American, and British transport aircraft during the Berlin airlift. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Soviet Union also provided late war variants to numerous communist countries like Yugoslavia and North Korea, the latter of which last saw service in the Korean War. Fast, agile, robust, and easy to maintain, Yak IXs were much loved by both pilots and ground crews. Production lasted from 1942 to 1948, during which time nearly 16,800 units were built, making Yak IXs one of the war's most mass-produced aircraft. Though Yak 15s weren't the most aesthetically pleasing aircraft, they were the Soviet Union's original first-generation jet fighters. Yak 15 development began at the outset of the jet age, immediately after World War II, when the great military powers were gearing up for the looming Cold War. Nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles tended to steal the spotlight, but developing potent fighters, bombers, interceptors, and ground attack aircraft was just as critical. In most applications, piston-engine machines were already obsolete, but the time and costs associated with developing entirely new aircraft were exorbitant. Jet engines were still relatively underpowered and unreliable, and in addition, everything from wings and airframes to cockpits and landing gears would need to be designed from the ground up, or so everybody thought. After the war, however, the Council of People's Commissars commissioned Yak to begin developing a new single-seat fighter, and they wanted it sooner rather than they wanted it later. To speed things up and keep costs low, designers opted to use the Yak III's airframe and power the new Warbird with a reverse-engineered Junkers Jumo 004 engine, the world's first operational turbojet. The Yak III's piston engine was removed, and the Soviet-built Jumo copy was mounted underneath the cockpit in a bulbous nacelle. Thrust and exhaust exited beneath the middle of the fuselage, giving the aircraft a stubby, unbalanced appearance. Only minor changes were made to the wings, which meant that unlike the revolutionary German Me-262 that had come years before, the new Yaks would have straight as opposed to swept wings. But though the use of outdated straight wings sped development and improved low-speed handling, the design was little more than a stopgap measure until more advanced aircraft could be developed. Even lighter than Yak IX's Yak XVs were approximately 30 feet long and weighed about 5,800 pounds when decked out for battle. The Jumo-derived Klimov RD-10 turbojets produced about 2,000 pounds of thrust, enough to propel the odd little aircraft to 490 miles per hour, though they got just 320 miles of combat range. Armaments included two 23mm cannons with 60 rounds of ammunition mounted on the upper corners of the inlet cowling to protect pilots from enemy fighters and ground fire. Yak 15s had armored seats and bulletproof windscreens, though the latter was only effective against small caliber rounds. Ground and taxi testing began in late 1945, during which time a number of flaws were discovered. Problems included weak landing gear components and inadequate heat shielding between the engine and fuselage, which often led to scorched aluminium and melted tail wheels, especially during takeoffs and landings. Even more dangerous, Yak 15 cockpits often filled with smoke as a result of oil leaking onto hot engine components, in which case pilots had to crack their canopies to allow fresh air to circulate. Yet despite these and other problems, Yak 15s were easy to fly, even for pilots who'd never been behind the stick of a jet-powered aircraft. After a brief stint at the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, TSAGI, for full-scale wind tunnel testing in January of 1946, just a few months later, two prototypes were ready for flight testing. Meanwhile, competitor MiG was developing the MiG-9, which was ready for testing at the same time, and as the story goes, representatives from the two design bureaus met in late April to flip a coin and determine which aircraft would be the first Soviet jet to fly. Yakovlev lost, and the MiG flew first. Subsequent testing yielded such positive results that the Council of Ministers issued an updated requirement for a new variant with an even more powerful RD-10 engine, which would be designated the Yak 17 RD-10. But though development was progressing more rapidly than anticipated, it all came nearly to a screeching halt when both Artem Mikhayan and Alexander Yakovlev were summoned to a meeting with Joseph Stalin. Typically not something you want to be doing. Fearing that they'd fallen out of favor with the fickle leader, both were relieved to discover that Uncle Joe only wanted them to produce aircraft that could participate in the upcoming annual parade in Red Square to commemorate the October Revolution. Not surprisingly, the aircraft were delivered well before the deadline, but because they weren't technically ready for full-scale production, all were stripped down to bare bones. Since time was of the essence and there were no other jets in the Soviet arsenal, the Yak 15, Yak 17 RD-10 was ordered into production in early 1947, even before having passed its official state acceptance trials. Less than a year later, nearly 300 aircraft had been built, but despite being designated as a fighter, most were relegated to training duties. Of those that weren't, most were distributed to fighter regiments in the USSR, Poland, Romania, and Hungary, where they quickly became antiquated. As early as the late 1950s, developing vertical takeoff and landing VTOL aircraft was a priority for many of the world's largest air forces. Thanks to more powerful engines, advanced avionics, and computer-aided design capabilities, the prospect of building aircraft that could take off and land vertically and fly at supersonic speeds seemed increasingly likely. Producer of the Siddeley Harrier, Britain's Hawker, largely pioneered the concept, but in France, Dassault was also experimenting with a supersonic VTOL variant of the Mirage, and the Soviets were busy developing the Yak 38. Designated Forger by NATO ostensibly for its likeness to Hawker's Harrier, the Yak 38 was the Soviets' only operational VTOL strike fighter, as well as its first fixed-wing carrier-based aircraft. Yak 38 served almost exclusively on Kiev-class carriers between the 1960s and 1990s, but unlike Harriers, the Soviet VTOL aircraft had 3 engines, instead of just one. The first, located in the mid-portion of the fuselage, was a Temansky R-28 turbofan that produced about 15,000 pounds of thrust that was used for both lift and level flight. Located in the aircraft's shoulders beside the center of the larger Temansky engine were two Rybinsk RD-38 turbojet lift fans, each of which thumped out an additional 7,000 pounds of thrust. Together, these potent power plants provided more than ample oomph to get the 25,000-pound aircraft airborne and flying vertically. But they were heavy, and they were complex, consuming copious amounts of fuel, and gave Yak 38 their characteristic bulging waistlines, which made them far less aerodynamic than most traditional aircraft. Nonetheless, range was a respectable 800 miles, and with top speeds of approximately 800 miles per hour, they were technically supersonic, if just barely. Another major drawback inherent to many VTOL aircraft was their undersized wings. Smaller wings create less drag, but they also produce less lift during level flight, which means that armament loads are relatively light. Yak 38s also had good low-speed, low-altitude maneuverability, but they weren't much of a match for traditional aircraft at higher speeds and altitudes. As with all VTOL aircraft, the development and testing phases were more protracted, and a number of crashes resulted in test pilot deaths. As a result, early models were fitted with an automatic ejection system. If an engine failed during takeoff and the aircraft rolled past 60 degrees in any direction, the pilot was ejected from the aircraft automatically. But though the first prototype flew in April of 1970, of the first 231 units built, most wouldn't enter service until nearly a decade later. It wasn't until the summer of 1979 that fighter wings aboard the three Kiev-class carriers began getting their new aircraft. By then, many of the troubles associated with VTOL operation had been ironed out, and the safety and performance of the aircraft was surprisingly good. A few saw limited service from forward airfields in Afghanistan during the 1980s, and just before Christmas in 1982, a pair of missile-armed Yak 38s operating from the carrier Minsk intercepted aircraft from the USS Enterprise while on patrol in the Arabian Sea, marking the first time armed Soviet VTOL aircraft encountered armed American aircraft. Thankfully, none of the aircraft involved in the incident launched weapons. In the end, Yak 38s were known for little more than their ability to take off and land vertically like helicopters. In most other respects, they compared poorly to traditional aircraft, and all were retired in 1991, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I really hope you enjoyed today's video. If you'd like to learn about another invention that changed the shape of warfare, please do check out our video on the proximity fuse, fascinating little device, which I am linking to on the screen now. And thank you for watching.